In the last lesson, Socrates, along with Glaucon and Adeimantus, began to build the city in speech. The city began in the cooperation for the meeting of basic bodily needs. The first city that they built, however, which aimed pretty much entirely at the meeting of basic bodily needs, was abandoned because Glaucon didn't think it had within it enough to make for a satisfying human life. So it was abandoned in favor of the building of an expansive and luxurious city. And such a city, as Socrates argued, required the building of an army. And out of the building of this army, we got a political problem. How can one have a military class which is fierce enough to defend the city, but at the same time is gentle and orderly internally with one another and with their fellow citizens? How do you create a military class that is harsh towards enemies and helpful towards their friends, their fellow community? And Socrates said, well, in the last lesson, he said, well, Guardian needs to have a nature which is both spirited, for the sake of bravery, but also philosophic, for the sake of moderate and tame behavior towards fellow citizens. And I mentioned last time that this term philosophic is used in a kind of strange way. He's not saying that it is a nature that pursues wisdom for its own sake. By philosophic, he just means gentle towards their own. And that's where we left off. But Socrates says, and Adeimantus agrees, that next they need to talk about how to educate such guardians. How do we educate them to be moderate and courageous? And that's the subject of this lesson, the education of the guardians who make up the military, but also, because of that, the governing class within the city and speech. Their education has two parts, music and gymnastic. Music meaning the education of the soul, and gymnastic the training of the body. Those are the provisional meanings. The primary purpose of their education is the formation of their characters, and in particular, making them courageous and moderate. This is not a liberal education for its own sake. This is character formation to make them good citizens. They must be courageous, as I said, because they must be tough and fearless on the battlefield, unquestioningly loyal to the security of their community, willing to die rather than to surrender or see their country conquered. Without the courage to defend the community unquestioningly and to keep order, the whole city could fall. The well-being of the whole city depends upon the courage and endurance of the guardian class. But at the same time, they must be moderate. And by moderate here, I mean something like self-controlled. They have to be obedient to rulers, tame in their behavior internally, peaceful and friendly in their relationship with one another, gentle with the common people. With moderation in dealing with fellow citizens, without moderation in dealing with fellow citizens, the guardians could themselves become the greatest threat to the city, growing proud and harsh and oppressive. They could drag the city into civil war, or worse. So again, this education that they will receive, this formation that they receive, is not aimed at the discovery of truth for its own sake. It is aimed at good citizenship and service to the community. They must help their friends, their fellow citizens, and harm their enemies, dangerous outsiders, and criminals. They must, in other words, be utterly devoted to the common good. As we noted last time, Socrates says that the guardian can be a dangerous character. When poorly educated, he can be a wolf. When properly educated, a guard dog. So, the musical education, the formation of their souls, is the first part of the education that he discusses. Now, the Greek word music has a broader meaning than our word music. Musicae, it does refer to music in our sense, words sung to a tune with a beat or a rhythm. I mean, music in the ordinary sense. But music is broader than that. And music was, in fact, pervasive in Greek society. And for the Greeks, the term music covers areas that we might refer to as literature. So, for example, the epic poems of Homer, the tragedies of Sophocles, even some of the products of the Greek historians, all the hymns sung at religious festivals and at meals, all the hymns that conveyed to their listeners stories about gods, about ancestors, about the heroes, about the laws. All of these things could be encompassed under the word music. Music was the primary way that ordinary Greeks learned about their own community, their past, their gods, and their duties. So music was very important. And Socrates' discussion of the musical education of the guardians concerns not just the content of the music, although that gets a lot of attention. That is, it's not just about the kind of tales that are told and sung, but it also concerns the way in which that content, those words, is delivered. Right? So he talks about what kinds of speeches can be imitated versus what ones must be merely narrated. He talks about what kinds of melodies or modes are allowable and what kinds aren't. What sort of rhythms should be allowed and what ones aren't. All aspects of music are discussed and are subject to regulation because of the claim that every aspect of music affects the character of those who listen to it. And since they're concerned with forming the character of guardians, and since every aspect of music can influence that character, every aspect of music is subject to regulation for the sake of the common good. Now, the discussion of music education is well known for a few reasons. And in the first place, because Socrates picks a fight with Homer. Homeric poetry in this passage is subject to severe criticism. And of course, Homer was the great Greek poet, the father of the tragedians, the one who educated the Greeks about their gods. Socrates will claim that Homer misrepresents the gods and the heroes, and thereby corrupts those who listen to him. So we have a critique of Homer from a moral or political perspective. Homer makes for bad citizens. The second reason why this section is well known is because Socrates advocates a comprehensive system of what we would call censorship. He not only criticizes Homer, but he lays out models and regulations for what kinds of stories can be told and which can't. So there's no such thing as freedom of speech in the City speech. Music is regulated, again, because it is so important for the formation of citizens who are devoted to the common good. Modern defenses of freedom of speech, therefore, oftentimes, at least initially, took the form of defenses of the claim that allowing for great freedom of speech was actually better for society, was actually better for the common good. That is, they accepted the standard that Socrates lays down. Freedom of speech is only defensible if it's good for citizens and good for the community. He argues that it's not, that music must be censored. Now, the discussion of music is guided by, I would say, two basic principles. First, because gods and heroes are held up as being superior to mere human beings, gods and heroes inevitably end up being what we today would call role models. People will tend to look to them for standards of conduct, for standards of what constitutes noble or admirable behavior, and thus people will tend to imitate the behavior of gods and heroes, because people tend to imitate the behavior of those whom they are taught to admire. And none are more admirable than are the gods and the heroes. So, stories about gods and heroes are inevitably presenting role models of a sort that will be imitated. The second principle is that human beings are at their most impressionable when they're young, and that therefore the kind of role models that citizens are presented with must be strictly regulated from the very beginning, from the earliest ages. So, from childhood and the nursery all the way to old age, the kinds of models that citizens are presented with must be regulated so that they are taught to admire beings that themselves exemplify the virtues that a good citizen ought to have. And that's the way to make citizens who will be obedient to good laws, Socrates says. Now he begins the discussion of music with the discussion of the speeches, the content of the music, the lyrics, if you will, and specifically with the speeches about the gods, right, which forms the basis for the word theology. The first recorded use of the word theology is here in Book 2 of the Republic, speeches about the gods. And remember, speeches about the gods has already shown up as a problem in the Republic. Remember, Adeimantus had pointed out that traditional accounts of the gods and the teachings of various priests and poets suggest that gods do not reliably reward virtue or act virtuously, and do not reliably punish vice. And what's more, that it's possible for unjust people to use sacrifices and incantations to bribe the gods in order to evade punishment for unjust deeds. The traditional Homeric gods are morally unreliable. They set a bad example. They form part of the case for injustice. Now, Socrates addresses this problem. He says that Homer has depicted the gods falsely, although he doesn't really prove how he knows that. He just says it. And he chastises Homer, saying he has falsely represented the gods. And how can people learn to be good citizens, obedient to their parents, to their elders, to their superiors, and friendly with one another when they're raised hearing stories about how the greatest of the gods, Zeus, overthrew and castrated his own father, when they hear stories about the incestuous love between gods, or stories about how gods are constantly fighting with one another, oftentimes over very petty squabbles, and so on. These Olympian gods are a mess. They're fit for a soap opera. It won't do. Therefore, that must be swept away. And instead, all depictions of the gods in their city, a city where the laws will be honored, will follow two rules. First, the rule is, because the gods are good, citizens will be taught that gods cause only good things for human beings. The gods do not harm human beings or treat them arbitrarily, and all evils or misfortunes that human beings suffer cannot be said to come from the gods, because the gods are good. So the gods are responsible for all that is good for us, and for none of what is evil for us. And those are the kind of gods that they will be taught to believe in. And the second rule, alongside gods only doing good, be the claim that because gods are wholly good and enjoy the best possible existence, they never seek to change their own shape or to deceive human beings. Gods are simple and truthful and constant and good. Now, anyone who's read Homer can see already that most of the plots of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as most Greek tragedies generally, have been utterly ruled out by these two rules about the gods, since Homeric and tragic stories are full of gods changing shape, deceiving people, causing misfortune, doing all sorts of deeds that human beings would be blamed to do. I mean, there's really not much left of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Homeric tradition after this. In their city, the gods are wholly good, harming neither human beings nor themselves, not each other, and they are therefore unwaveringly good role models. Now, are these rules based on genuine knowledge of the gods? Is Socrates correcting Homer because Homer is wrong? He certainly says or suggests that a few times, but he never discloses where his knowledge, if it is knowledge, of the gods comes from. And this is important because remember, just earlier in Book 2, Adeimantus had said, if there are gods and they care about human beings, then everything we know about them comes from the poets and the laws, and the poets and the laws tell us that the gods are morally unreliable. So already earlier in the book, this challenge has been laid down. If the gods are other than what we have been taught, you must show us how you know it. But Socrates claims that they're other, but then doesn't show where this knowledge comes from. And Adeimantus doesn't challenge him. Now you might say, why? Why doesn't he challenge him? Well, I think the answer is because at this point Adeimantus is thinking more as a founder of a city. And he's thinking, well, what should people be taught in order to be made good citizens? And so he's quite willing to go along with these rules because to him at least it is quite clear that you will produce better citizens if they are taught these kinds of stories about the gods rather than the Homeric ones. And that means really the question of the truth of this theology is set aside, and the whole discussion is guided by political utility. It's not because guardians must be taught the truth, but rather because they must believe that human beings live under the power of perfect and just divinities that they are taught these things. They are taught these things because you shouldn't allow them to blame the gods for human misfortunes and human mistakes. The gods must be altogether admirable, and in this way no guardian would ever be able to use the bad behavior of a god as an excuse for engaging in the same behavior himself or for the lamenting of the misfortunes that he suffers. So filial and paternal piety and fraternal piety will be fostered in the citizenry by holding up to them gods as models of this very same behavior. And that means the Homeric tradition is out the window. The next topic Socrates turns to is the topic of the afterlife. In the Homeric tradition, the afterlife is depicted as pretty much grim and horrible for almost everyone involved. Hades is a mindless, dark place where few, if anyone, retains anything admirable in their lives. It's a place of darkness. And Socrates says, this will never do. How can we produce brave warriors if they believe that death is terrible? How can we produce brave warriors if they believe that this life is all there is and after they're dead, everything's terrible? How can you do that? Our guardians, rather, must believe that the most terrible thing is not their personal individual death, but rather the defeat and enslavement of their community. That is the most terrible thing. They must value the well-being of their community ahead of their own lives. Otherwise, they might be tempted not to fight for their community and instead to choose lives for themselves. They might become cowardly or selfish on the battlefield. So the guardians must not be told that death and the afterlife are terrible things. They must be taught to believe that good and virtuous people have nothing to fear from death, from their own personal deaths. And in this way, they will not lament the deaths of their loved ones or comrades, and they will not fear their own deaths. What they will fear is the defeat of their community, and they will do everything up to and including sacrificing their own lives to preserve their community. Above all, these warriors must not be given over to lamenting the dead, to crying and wailing when misfortune befalls themselves or their loved ones. So no stories must be told about gods or heroes lamenting death or wailing and gnashing their teeth. Right? Because Socrates says, if somebody sees Zeus going to pieces, crying and wailing because of the death of a loved one, then surely they'll believe that it's okay for a mere human being to do the same. If it's not below Zeus to lament death, it's surely not below a human being to do the same. But if they thought that, they would become overly attached to their own lives and to their own goods and might be tempted to put those things ahead of the welfare of their community. And that would compromise their quality as guardians. So it's not allowed. But again, this principle seems to be dictated not by truth. Socrates doesn't say, I went down to the underworld and found out it was great, so we can tell these stories. It's dictated by utility. The city will have braver warriors, willing to risk all for the common good, if they believe that death is nothing terrible. So the stories about the gods are meant to make the guardians obedient and respectful to their elders, friendly with one another, and the stories about the afterlife are meant to make them brave. So those are the discussion of the speeches about the gods and the afterlife. Socrates then moves on to the speeches about the heroes. Heroes were kind of semi-divine beings, like Achilles, who might have one mortal parent and one immortal parent. They populate the Homeric epics and a lot of the tragedies. And Socrates says, okay, well, what should be said about them? And at this point, he goes through a number of characteristics that he says they must be shown to exemplify, and a number of vices that they must never be permitted to exhibit. So in other words, again, the heroes are discussed as role models. Right. So, no vicious heroes. For example, heroes won't be depicted as buffoons, and they especially cannot be depicted as lacking self-control. Heroes must be presented as moderate and self-controlled when it comes to their bodily passions, right? They're not drunken or gluttonous, overcome by lust. They can't be depicted committing crimes or rapes or other kinds of hubristic outrages. They must not be shown to be insulting and insubordinate towards their commanders. So in other words, heroes can't be depicted the way most Homeric heroes are depicted. Homeric heroes do all of those things, especially Achilles. Now, for convenience sake, this set of virtues of sort of self-control, moderation, obedience, all these things, I group under the general heading moderation, because Socrates does the same thing, self-control. So the heroes will be presented as exhibiting moderation, and of course bravery. And so on the whole, the gods and heroes, the role models in this city, depicted in its official poetry, will be models of courage, moderation, and the various virtues of a good and pious citizen. Not necessarily because those are the truest speeches, but because those are the speeches most likely to form good citizens. Socrates discusses many other aspects of music as well, although I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. But he lays down a rule, for example, that speeches of bad men cannot be directly imitated in the city's poetry. Only the speeches of good men doing and saying good things can be directly depicted. Only heroes behaving heroically will have speaking parts, so to speak, in the city's poetry. And you have to remember that this poetry was recited, right? Whether it's a drama being acted out on the stage or some rhapsode reciting Homer, right? And so when poetry is being recited, when the poetry is written in the first person, the person who's reciting the poem sort of becomes that character, like an actor. You are impersonating someone. When you start reciting one of Hamlet's speeches, for example, you're kind of impersonating Hamlet at that moment. And the question Socrates is getting at is, who will the guardians be allowed to impersonate when they're reciting this poetry? And the answer is, only good people doing good things. And so as you can imagine, this rule makes it virtually impossible for there to be any kind of stage drama in this city. Because dramas usually involve good guys and bad guys, or good people doing bad things or having problems, and that can't be directly imitated. So in this city, for the most part, you're just going to have hymns and epics, but not direct performances. Now the reasoning behind this, why ban bad speeches? The reason why is that Socrates claims we tend to become like that which we imitate. So especially when we habitually imitate bad people doing bad things or bad speeches, it will warp our character. We will get used to being like that. We will build that bad habits thereby. What we imitate rubs off on us. And in general, it's a principle in the Republic that that which we habitually imitate becomes part of our nature. Right? And we tend, this is one of the reasons I think why we're very concerned with the kind of media that children consume oftentimes, why we will not let children see or listen to certain things that we will let adults see or listen to, because we assume that those things will have an influence on the children. And by influence, we mean that it might make the children want to do those things the more they get used to seeing or imitating them. Well, Socrates applies that same reasoning to all the citizenry. From youth until old age, that which you're allowed to imitate rubs off on you. Therefore, you better only imitate things that make you the kind of person you ought to be. So this means that in the city and speech, when they recite poetry, they will only be allowed to impersonate the good characters. So that's the principle of imitation. Everything else, it's not that bad people will never be talked about, it's that everything else would be narrated in indirect discourse. So it'd be like Star Wars, but with only Obi-Wan Kenobi speaking directly, and everything that Darth Vader says and does being recounted third person. Now, since the primary virtues of the guardians are courage and moderation, Socrates also lays down that only musical modes or keys, so like actual music, will be allowed that reinforces those two virtues. Right? Only music that's appropriate to brave people doing brave deeds, or music that's appropriate to moderate people acting moderately will be allowed. But music that is more kind of sensuous or idle, that's appropriate to other kinds of pursuits like partying or what have you, that kind of music will not be allowed. And again, the reasoning here is because music has great influence on our soul. Music insinuates itself into us and fosters certain attitudes or behaviors. So the music that we habitually listen to will also form our characters. So if we habitually listen to music that makes us feel idle or sensual or luxurious, we will acquire the habit of feeling that way. But on the other hand, if we habitually listen to music that makes us feel brave or self-controlled, then we will acquire the habit of feeling that way. Therefore, just as the guardians must be shown only role models that exhibit the virtues proper to them, they must listen only to music that, in a sense, musically depicts those same virtues. So the music, and the same thing goes for the rhythms. So the rhythms and the music and the modes of imitation are all there to reinforce the speeches, which are there to reinforce the virtues that a good guardian must have. This way they have the virtues, they have, the hope is, a kind of integrity in their souls that make them into good citizens. So now just to summarize the discussion of the music education, we see then that the entire discussion of the music education is geared towards producing guardians who exhibit a number of what we would call moral virtues. The goal of this education is character formation, to make them the best possible warriors and administrators, or in other words, that make them disposed to serve the common good, and to put the common good ahead of their own personal concerns, or better yet, to see their own personal concerns as being identical to that of the common good. That's the purpose of this education. But now notice what hasn't been proven yet. It hasn't been proven that it would actually be good to be one of these guardians. Remember in the previous lesson, I said that one of the main questions of the Republic is the relationship between the common good and one's own individual or private good, and whether it can be shown that a life devoted to the good of others or to the common good is also good and even best for oneself. It's clear that the life of the guardians, the education of the guardians, is meant to make them believe that it is best for them to serve the common good. But we don't know whether that's true. It's clear why it would be useful for a guardian to believe something like that, but just because it's useful doesn't make it true. So Socrates has now started making guardians devoted to the common good and given them a number of virtues to that end. We don't yet know, though, whether these guardians are happy. So far, their virtue is entirely in the service to the city. And this question will come up again in the next lesson. But before concluding, I need to say a few words about the other part of their education. We've been talking so far about their character education, their musical education, the speeches that they should hear, the role models that they'll have. Then Socrates talks about what's called their gymnastic education, the education of their bodies. And gymnastic in Greek, this is not gymnastics in the sense of the Olympics. Gymnastic, it really means the training of the body, the physical training of the body. Although Socrates says almost nothing about that, I think because it's pretty clear what kinds of things they would need to do to, train to use weapons and ride horses and go hunting and all that kind of stuff. There's no need to get into technical detail about the training of their bodies. Instead, almost the entire discussion of gymnastic education consists in a discussion of food and a condemnation of the art of medicine. And that might be strange seeming, but here's what's going on. Socrates, in the course of discussing the music education, purifies the city. And Glaucon actually comes in at a certain point, and it's recognized that this supposedly luxurious city that had made an army necessary in the first place has actually grown to be a moderate city again. Not moderate in the sense of rustic country bumpkins, but moderate in the sense that the ruling class in this city is subject to a very austere education that makes them very moderate and self-controlled, because if they weren't, they'd be bad guardians. And so when we get to gymnastic education, Socrates says, well, of course, they need to have a diet that's fit for moderate warriors, right? No fancy desserts and fancy food, basically just roasted meat on a stick. Simple food for warriors who have a job to do. And at any rate, he says, if you ever have a city that needs a lot of courts and judges, or that needs a lot of doctors, what that proves is that you have an immoderate city. Why do people need doctors? Because they're sick. And he claims, why do people get sick? Well, usually it's because they're immoderate and they're eating all sorts of things they shouldn't and not taking care of their body. In a city where people are moderate and act properly, there will be very little need for doctors. And at any rate, we will not encourage any sophisticated art of medicine, because he implies the art of, if the practice of the art of medicine makes people worry too much about their own personal health, and it makes them worry too much about dying. The art of medicine, according to Socrates, is for the most part an art that people cultivate in order to try to avoid dying for as long as possible. And that's not the way our warriors should think. They shouldn't be afraid of death. And what's more, Socrates says, in any city under good laws, every citizen will have some job to do for the city. And nobody should be allowed to sit around being idle. And so, when people get sick, maybe they'll be given some simple treatments or simple cures. And if those don't work, then either the people will die or they'll get better on their own. But there won't be any sophisticated art of medicine that allows people to convalesce or be convalescents for long periods of time. You either die or get better and get back to work. And that seems very austere and maybe even almost heartless to us, but it's based on the principle that in this city, everybody has a job to do for the whole. Nobody's allowed to be idle, even if it's because they're sick. And of course, even specifically with the warriors, there should not be excessive concern for bodily well-being. Their concern should be with service to the city, and they should be willing to die for that service. So there would be just a very simple art of medicine. So really the discussion of gymnastic education is really a discussion of the care of the body, and the main point of it is that the care of the body should be subordinate to the cultivation of virtue and service to the city. Medicine is not oriented towards an individual's desire to avoid death. Medicine is geared towards fixing those who can be fixed so they can get back to work and letting the rest die, in effect. As I said, it's not the way we practice things today. And even Glaucon notes that it's very austere. He says this is in effect, a very political medicine, Socrates. And it is. And then Socrates ends the discussion of gymnastic by unveiling what he calls the true purpose of gymnastic. Initially, he'd said music exists to educate the soul, gymnastic exists to educate the body. But Socrates says, in fact, gymnastic also exists for the training of the soul. And here's what he means. He says, people who love music, but never exercise their bodies or do anything vigorous, usually end up being, we would say nowadays, kind of wimpy. Whereas people who spend all their time exercising and playing sports and other vigorous physical activity, but never listen to music and don't care about thinking and don't care about poetry, those kind of people end up being kind of barbarians and unreasonable and harsh. Now, our guardians in this city, they must be open to music, but they must also be tough. So they need a proper balance of a musical education and gymnastic education. The music will open their souls to virtue and to service and make them open to reason and be willing to deal with one another peacefully and listen to persuasion. Remember the problem at the beginning of the book with Polemachus? How can you persuade us if we won't listen? These guardians will be warriors who are willing to listen to those that they believe are wise. So the music opens them up to reason and virtue. The gymnastic keeps them tough and spirited. So it's a harmonizing of toughness, of courage, and moderation. So the gymnastic and the music balance one another out to produce a guardian that is a mixture of courage and moderation. And that's the discussion of the education. And again, I want to note that the end of this education is the formation of a certain number of habits or moral virtues that make the guardians serve the common good. The question that will come up in the next lesson and further on in the Republic is whether, in fact, the virtues that these guardians have been given are genuine virtues that they need in order to live well, or whether these virtues simply make them useful citizens, but don't necessarily contribute to their own personal happiness. The connection between the private good and the common good is still problematic and will continue to be further on in the book.